My talk today will address questions of uh, collectivization and political mobilization of paid domestic workers. Now, the issue has kind of shifted ground considerably in the new millennium. And this begins with the ILO Convention 189, in which decent work for domestic workers was given considerable importance. Now, from that convention, around that convention, the convention was constructed on the advocacy of and following the lines of legislative change in South Africa. South Africa has some of the best laws in the world, the global best practices in domestic work legislation, which has set a much higher benchmark. So following that, there has been a demand to internationalize these best practices. However, what is interesting about the domestic work sector is that it is very sharply polarized between major improvements and very oppressive working conditions on the other. So on one hand, you have International Federation of Domestic Workers, you have considerable advance in working conditions, mobilization, and all that. And at the same time, you have another segment of the sector, which is in working in slave-like conditions with no rights, no. So there are these two very extreme ends within the domestic work sector. And that is something to keep in mind as a context. Now, within that, in the new millennium, there has been two very noticeable developments. Agarwal and Saha, in an article in 2018, point out that in the period after the ILO Convention, there has been a shift to female-dominated and female-led unions across the world, but particularly in South Asia. And this is more interesting in the context of South Asia because in South Asia, the early, firstly, until the 1980s, domestic work was not a female-dominated occupation. More men than women worked as domestic workers. And the early organizations were also men's organizations, trade unions, conventional trade unions, with connections with large political party affiliated federated unions, what we call central trade unions. So in the 70s, from the 50s to the 70s, you did have some unions of this sort. It is from the 80s that you started having feminization of domestic work. More women than men began to work in the sector. And you had the beginnings of organization, beginning with a group in Pune, then in Bombay, and then in various other parts of the country, primarily led by NGOs and women's organizations. We'll come to that in a little bit. But in recent years, it is interesting that domestic work is more and more associated only with women. The three C's, cooking, cleaning, and care. Now, why this is interesting is because you can define, if you take the ILO definition of domestic work, that would include drivers, security guards, gardeners, other kinds of workers, not only cooking and cleaning, which then would considerably increase the proportion of men in domestic work. But that is not the definition that is usually taken. A narrower definition is taken, in which women become the predominant segment of the workforce. So now you have, from 2011, increasingly female-dominated, female-led trade unions. And in this phase, two issues have dominated union activity. One is the permission to have unions, the registration of trade unions. The union itself is an issue. And the other is minimum wage. Now, I will not read this slide out. It just shows you that almost in every state now of India, there are domestic workers organizations. Not all of them are have any links with central trade unions. Some of them are what are now called labor NGOs, which is associations, societies which focus on labor issues but are not trade unions in the proper definition of the term. Among these various unions that were set up in the immediate post-2011 period, the most interesting is the Andhra Pradesh State Domestic Workers Union, because they successfully put up a candidate in the elections in 2014. She didn't win, but she stood for and campaigned in the parliamentary elections representing the Domestic Workers Union. So you have major developments like that. And there has been an attempt, because there are so many state level, local associations, unions, and a range of kind of bodies, to create a national platform. And the National Progressive Domestic Workers Federation was organized by TUCC. With the initiative in 2014, it hasn't developed very much in this period, but it is still an important initiative. Along with this, you have various NGOs, of which the National Domestic Workers Movement, which was led by initially by missionaries, was and has become a very, very important platform. And they have a national presence, and it is one of the largest domestic workers association in the country. Now, within this context, what I want to do is focus a little bit on West Bengal. The reason for this focus is primarily because West Bengal has a history of militant trade unionism. Under the left front government, new categories of workers were being unionized. You not only had groups like agricultural workers, construction workers, various categories of unusual categories of workers were organized by primarily the C2, but also other organizations during left front government. However, West Bengal was one of the few states in India in this period where the state government has been unwilling to facilitate unionization of domestic workers. The Labor Department has taken the view, during the left front government, it took the view that domestic work is not covered under the Trade Union Act. Now, given the fact that many other states have given registration to domestic workers' trade unions, and Trade Union Act is a central act, this is a very peculiar position. Nevertheless, the West Bengal state government, under the left front government and now under the new Trinamool government, has consistently argued that domestic workers cannot be given registration under Trade Unions Act. Why? Because it is not the relationship between, because it's not a trade. The definition of a trade is that you undertake trade for profit. Now, the employer who is employing the domestic worker is not engaged in a profitable activity. So it is not a trade. So the employment relationship, therefore, is not a trade relationship. Therefore, you cannot have a trade union. This is their argument. Now, it is supported by trade unions themselves, and particularly left political parties and organizations, because domestic work is not quote unquote productive work. Of course, it isn't. It is reproductive work. It is not productive work by standard economic definition or by standard Marxist definition. And so they argue that these categories of workers who are not engaged in productive work should not form trade unions. They can form other kinds of organizations, but these organizations cannot be registered as trade unions. Now, in all this mess, there is one trade union, one domestic workers union, the Balurghat Agrogami Poricharika Union, the first one you see on the slide, was given registration. Now, when the government was asked why they got registration and others did not, the government said that it was a mistake and that they had given this trade union registration, but was not going to give any other trade union registration. And for many years, they in fact didn't. So there were piles of applications given to the Labor Department, which they rejected. Then I've given you the name of some of the unions which have made these applications, who have not been given trade union registration. In the meanwhile, there were some other unions which were not organized by political parties, but by NGOs or other kinds of associations. Of these, the Paschim Bongo Griho Sahayika Mohila Samiti was formed by EDWA, which is not quite an NGO. And the third one on this list, Paschim Bongo Griho Poricharika Samiti, which was organized by an NGO called Srishti, they also received registration in 2018. So at the moment, West Bengal has only 2 registered trade unions. Now, in this context, I want to raise a second debating point. While the trade unions say that domestic work is not a productive occupation and therefore domestic workers cannot be unionized. This applies to many other informal occupations, especially women's occupations in the city. And the most important of that for particularly feminist activists is sex workers. And you may know that West Bengal was one of the first states in India where there was a movement to rename prostitutes as sex workers and a demand for sex workers' trade unions. This was in the early to mid-90s. And in this, there was a union formed. It was not given registration, but the Durbar the Mohila Samanvay Committee did make considerable advance, and it is after this initiative started in West Bengal that it spread to other parts of the country. Now, this organization very acutely understood that there are multiple links between these two occupations, between sex work and domestic work. So they began to extend their remit to also include domestic work, and they started another union of domestic workers. Now, when domestic workers organizations came together in a platform for campaign reasons, for advocacy reasons, the participation of Durbar became a problem. And some organizations argued that since the idea of the domestic workers movement was to try and win respectability for domestic workers, their association with the sex workers movement was harming the cause of domestic workers. Now, this kind of argument clearly then complicates solidarities of movements within the informal sector. And what it does, it raises questions about definitional complexities. And I say this because one of the reasons why domestic workers don't want to form unions and not other kinds of association. You can call yourself a domestic workers society or association, register yourself under the Societies Registration Act. But why they don't want to do that, why they want a union, is because to form a union gives you the identity of the worker. And that is a crucial thing for them, that they are considered. So this is a transition for them. It is a transition from being a servant to a worker. And with all the dignity and respect that is associated with workers as opposed to servants. So while they are striving for this dignity and respect, making the transition from servant to a worker, it is complicated that some of them are not able to link this with the struggle of prostitutes to become sex workers. So these are similar struggles. So sex workers engaged in this struggle earlier when they struggled for the renaming of prostitution as sex work. So when domestic workers are today fighting to become domestic workers as opposed to servants, they are engaging in a very similar struggle. So these are some of the contradictions that have arisen in the course of these movements, and particularly some of the debates that have arisen in the context of West Bengal. Now, I've just given you a list of some of the states in India which does have minimum wage for domestic workers, but most states don't. And this is one major ongoing struggle, again, because while domestic workers associations appreciate that a minimum wage may not be make any substantial difference to the amount they earn, being included in the schedule for minimum wage also confers them the legal status as workers. So in West Bengal then, we should look at two new developments that have transformed the way transformed the way domestic workers organize, but it has also been very important in understanding how workers within the informal sector operate and have imagined new forms of politics. The first is, so we do normally associate workers movement with workplace mobilization, workplace solidarity, workplace mobilization. Trade unions are primarily initially factory-based, but if not factory, office-based, they're centered on relations in the workplace. The nature of domestic workers is, however, that their workplace is dispersed. Like homes are dispersed, their workplace is dispersed. So workplace-based organizations are not going to be possible. So then by what other means can be used? What will be the physical location of mobilization? And one of the most likely scenarios, it has been found, is to have neighborhood-based mobilization. And why is that so such an important political step? Because we have found, for instance, in a survey I did in 2006, 2008, we found that in some poor localities, almost 90% adult women of the population of that locality are engaged in domestic work. So domestic work being such an important occupation of women in poor neighborhoods means that not only is it possible to organize domestic workers by focusing on the neighborhood politics can be stimulated and rejuvenated by focusing on domestic workers' issues. And we looked at a few organizations where political mobilization in neighborhoods started with other issues, but then moved to issues of domestic workers because most women in that neighborhood were domestic workers, and these were the issues that interested. That is, these are the issues that the demand came from within the community. So neighborhood-based mobilization has proved an important strategy for domestic workers' organization. The second is alliance building within the informal sector. I've already spoken of sex work and the difficulties of alliance building with sex workers, but other informal sector occupations, especially home-based occupations, home-based production, has proved very suitable for alliance building with domestic workers. Domestic workers often do the same people do both kinds of work, or at least the people in the same neighborhoods do these kinds of work. So people who sew or make things, cut nails, in home-based occupations, they tend to more easily make alliances with domestic workers organizations. So this has also proved a fairly useful, productive way of making domestic workers unions. Now, these strategies have to be looked at in the context of mobilization in the informal sector in recent years. We know that trade unions have conventionally been unfriendly to the informal sector, and they have been unfriendly to women. I have given you a few figures in this slide. I'm not repeating those, but generally speaking, central trade unions have, things have changed a little bit in the new millennium. Until the late 90s, there was very little interest from the new millennium, trade unions have also, after a decade of liberalization, trade unions have also realized that sticking to the formal sector has been very costly for them. Their memberships has been falling. Their ability to confront employers has been considerably reduced. So they have started becoming interested in informal sector workers. But this is it's not an organized strategy. They have picked up this or that informal sector to organize. In West Bengal, the informal sectors which have seen very high unionization have tended to be all male occupations. The example I often give is that of the transport sector. If you look at the transport unions in Calcutta, bus unions, taxi unions, auto rickshaw unions, these are some of the strongest unions in West Bengal. The auto rickshaw union, for instance, it's no longer quite so powerful. But at one time, it would bring the city to a halt. And this is not only informal, it is a paralegal sector. And yet it had a huge unionization drive and a very successful unionization drive. But auto rickshaws, the transport sector, is typically a masculine sector. And it is these kinds of sectors in which central trade unions, when they have worked in the informal sector, they have tended to work in these sectors. Now, I don't need to say this, but domestic work is obviously at the very extreme end of the informal sector. There is no contract, there is hire and fire at will, there is no standardization of wages. It is so informal that we don't even know how many domestic workers there are in the country. If you look at this list I've given you, the estimate varies from 2.52 million by the NSSO to 50 million. I mean, 2 million and 50 million, if you can't say whether it's 2 million or 50 million, then that is a slightly ridiculous situation. But different counting, also because the definition of domestic work is so there is no agreed definition. So different people use different definitions to count. This also means you have statistical confusion. But this extreme informality of the domestic worker has also been a difficulty in the way of their organization. Now, when I say that central trade unions have been particularly unfriendly to women-dominated informal sector, there is also a history of trade unions having an uncomfortable relationship with women in the formal sector. And the two states in India, which actually have a very long and strong left tradition where there has been militant trade union activity, a high density of trade union activity, have both had very unfortunate history of trade unions' relationship with women. Kerala, you have the famous Munnar plantations case where women workers went on strike and they refused to work with central trade unions on the grounds that central trade unions had sold them down the river. And they threw out central trade union leaders who came to support their strike and formed their own trade union. Vijay also established another women's trade union for informal sector women workers on the ground that central trade unions had not given any attention to their issues. In West Bengal, there is an additional complication. And that complication, so we have already addressed the question of whether domestic work is productive work, a trade, whether that means they can have trade unions or not. And this is a very important debate. This is a very important position that all the left parties have taken. This means that their trade unions don't organize these kinds of women workers, not only domestic workers, but other forms of women workers, which doesn't come under their definition of productive. This means that when they want to mobilize or organize these workers, the responsibility is given to the women's front. So the Ganatantrik Mahila Samiti, rather than C2, gets the responsibility for organizing domestic work. Now, the Ganatantrik Mahila Samiti is primarily composed of and led by middle-class women who are themselves employers of domestic workers. If they are given the responsibility of organizing domestic workers, then you have a clear conflict of interest within the organization. And this became very evident when the domestic workers they were organizing wanted a rise in wages. And so the leadership was not very willing to endorse this demand. So while this is true, this is an important consideration. It is also important to note that almost in India, all organizers are employers of domestic, even trade union leaders are employers of domestic workers. So this is not specific to the Women's Association, but the conflict of interest within a women's association becomes more complicated and difficult to deal with. So these are some of the issues I wanted to flag in relation to recent developments in Domestic Workers Association. I should say that some of what I'm saying is drawn from two projects that I undertook, two research projects I undertook on domestic workers. One was in 2006, 7, 8. It went on till 2008. And another was in the period 2013 to 15. Now, in that second round, 2013-15, I worked with the Paschim Bongo Griha Paricharika Samiti, the group who received registration in 2018. So that's a declaration of interest. And I should also say that there were many other people associated with these research projects. Their names are, some of their names are given on the slide. I'll stop there.